Hello, friends. My name is JJ, and as you probably heard a few days ago, the Prime Minister of Canada, Mark Carney, called a snap election. Even though the next scheduled Canadian general election wasn't supposed to be until October, Carney used his prerogative as Prime Minister to make it earlier on April 28th. This had been widely anticipated, but it still does mean that Canada is now plunged into an election campaign just days after getting a new Prime Minister. I'm going to have a full video on the election very soon, but in the meantime, I thought you guys might enjoy this gimmicky video, which is based on a format that I used during the last Canadian general election. Basically, I am going to have 3 conversations about the Canadian election with 3 people of gradually increasing levels of knowledge of Canadian politics. We're going to start with my friend Jazza, whose Canadian political knowledge is relatively low, and then my friend Tim, who I would say has a somewhat moderate amount of Canadian political knowledge, and then my friend Cole, whose political knowledge is quite advanced. Ready? Let's begin. Jazza John is a friend of mine from England, currently living in New York. He is a frequent guest on podcasts and streams and things, and has his own show about British politics called Right Dishonourable. All right, Jazza, thank you for spending some time with me on this.
Pleasure. I'm really happy to be the British idiot of the hour. What an honor.
So I guess what I would just begin by asking is, how much do you feel you know about Canadian politics?
I think I know the like top lines. If you were to ask ChatGPT to very briefly summarize Canadian politics, I think I'd probably get quite close to that. So I know who like the top guys are. Other than that, no clue. Okay,
so tell me, based on your understanding, what is the state of Canadian politics right now?
Oh, it's very exciting, actually. You know, I know that Canadian politics gets exciting because the BBC decides to cover it.
Okay.
And it's like, did you just? This is so embarrassing. You just had an election called, right? Like Mark Carney is now the new Prime Minister, and
yes.
He has just called an election because he had to soon anyway, and now we're about to see if how much Canadians hate Trump, right? Like that's what you're voting on.
Is that so? What do you mean by
that? Well, I think that he seems to have inadvertently or advertently tried to really adjust what is the word? The ground on which the Canadian election is now going to be fought is no longer about Canada. Like, it's about what Trump thinks of Canada and about the fact and what is it, elbows up?
Yes. Oh, very good.
Kind of not taking all of this rubbish from America. And from my understanding, that isn't what it was about before, which is why Trudeau kind of had to be kicked out because everybody hated him.
Yes. Okay.
And now that's kind of been turned around because your elbow's upping.
Yes. Okay. That's a pretty good summary. Carney is. Are you familiar with Carney? Because of course he had a job in England for a while.
Yeah,
there.
He came over.
Do you remember that? Yeah.
I literally only know him as the former governor of the Bank of England. That is the. I was like, oh, he went back. I knew that he went back to Canada because there was like a whole thing that I remember when he quit. It was like a big thing in the UK because he was also very critical of stuff like Brexit and stuff like that. And so all of the right-wing papers didn't like him very much. And I knew that he went back to Canada, but I didn't know he was going to become the bloody Prime Minister of Canada. But here we are. Good for him.
Was he well known in Britain? I mean, I've been thinking a lot about this because it's like, you know, the head of the central bank. Is that really a sort of very front of mind person? But in sort of like his sort of political machine has really been sort of hyping that, you know, he was this great figure in Great Britain and, you know, everybody loved him and knew him and all that.
I will give him a bit of kudos. It was a big position when he was in it, and so he was there trying to basically mitigate for a lot of the chaos that was coming post Brexit, and so was at loggerheads very often with certain members of like the ruling Conservative Party in the UK at the time, who maybe didn't want kind of like such an active Bank of England. But he really was like if you follow politics in the UK, you probably vaguely remember him. And is like I don't know who the head of the Bank of England is now. And so he clearly like turned that into a role that was more visible.
Do you remember thinking it was weird that he was not British?
Yeah, I thought it was very strange that he wasn't British. Kind of like the possibility of James Bond not being British. I just don't think it's right.
And you have a sort of general understanding that the Canadian political system is quite similar to the British political system, right?
Yeah, right. It's us. You're not doing the silly thing of having a president. Why would you have one of those? They're crazy. And we've got the same.
Yes.
We've got the same king.
We do, yes.
And we both have our monarch and our money.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a lovely point of. That's where the similarities end, I think, isn't it?
Yes,
really?
yes. Yeah. Yeah, well, and I mean, I guess sort of in the sense that you referred to how Mark Carney is calling the election, right? And the idea that the prime minister has the prerogative to sort of decide these sorts of things, that's a similarity. Remember that Sunak, right? He called an early election, and that was sort of seen as big news. And so I guess Carney calling an early election in Canada is a similar scene as a kind of a bit of a roll of the dice, right? Like when you call an early election, you're taking a bit of a chance, and that's what.
Yeah,
Carney
but what an exciting chance, isn't it?
I suppose so. Do you have a kind of, I guess one of the questions I would ask is, do you care who wins the Canadian election? Does this seem interesting to you at all? Be honest with me.
Well, yeah, 100%. Like, I'm a political anorak. I'm just ignorant to Canada, and I'm so sorry. But I, as a Brit, I love an underdog story, and with the lack of stability, shall we say, that a Trump presidency has brought, any country that is smaller than the US, which is all of them apart from China, anyone that wants to stick it to Trump a little bit, be it on the ice hockey field or with counter tariffs, I'm behind it. I love it. I love a rebel, and you all are being quite rebellious. Obviously in a very nice Canadian way, but you are. It's really cool to see.
Do you know anything about the guy who's running against Carney?
Well, which one? I think you'll find, JJ, that there are multiple parties vying to have the next prime minister.
Oh, very good. So, okay.
Who's educating who here? Do I know any of their names? No.
Well, what's your understanding? Okay, well, let's frame it that way. What is your understanding of the opposition that Prime Minister Carney faces for the top job?
So this is where my ignorance really is going to show through, because I only know them in relevance to the British parties. So I know that Carney's I was about to call it a team. Carney's team is not called Labour, but it's basically Labour. It's like the centre-left bloc. And then I believe your Conservative Party, like the centre-right bloc, are not called the Conservatives. Are they called the Liberals or something?
No. I think you're thinking of Australia, where they are called the Liberals. But no.
I am.
No, Carney's party is called the Liberals, and then the main opposition party is called the Conservatives. And the Canadian press even sometimes uses the British term Tory to describe them as well.
Oh, do you really? Oh, interesting. The only thing I know about the head Tory, as we can use that term here, and I told you this before we did this, I only have one image of him, and I think it comes from you, that you may have shared it in a video or something, and it's of him being interviewed, like a close-up interview, and he's there holding an apple,
yes.
and the journalist is asking a pointed question, like a difficult question, and he masculinely rips into the apple and is I have no idea what he says, but the energy is very affronting. And I remember seeing it for the first time and finding it incredibly funny.
A lot of people would say that you're simply taking a page out of the Donald Trump book.
Like which people would say that?
Well, I'm sure a great many Canadians, but
Like who?
I don't know who, but...
Well, you're the one who asked the question, so
yeah.
you must know somebody.
I remember actually I went to one of his events and they were really leaning into it. They literally like had baskets of apples at the door for his supporters as they filed into the place. Do you know what his name is?
No idea.
Okay.
Mr. Apple?
Mr. Apple, no. His name is Pierre Polyev. So it's a good... People,
Oh, yes,
Yeah.
and I have heard you say that
yeah,
before.
yeah. People tend to just call him Pierre. They just tend to call him by his first name, much like how people just called Sunak Rishi, right? But do you know anything about the other parties?
Okay, here we go. There are the Quebec bloc, the Quebecois folks, and they want to be independent and French speaking. I loved Montreal and I want to go back, so I ain't gonna say anything nasty.
Okay.
Is he Sikh, the guy with the turban?
Yes, the guy with the turban. Yes, he is.
All I know about, I don't know his name. And he was in coalition with Trudeau, and then threw a hissy fit and left.
Yeah, more
and
or
I
less.
understand him to be like basically the head of your equivalent of the Liberal Democrats, which may be wrong because the only thing that I'm basing that on is that their color is orange. I genuinely think that that's how I've made the link.
Yeah. I mean, I often sort of struggle with this question of, how to exactly map the Canadian parties onto the British parties, because I feel like in some ways, like the NDP, so he is Jagmeet Singh and he's the head of the NDP, the New Democratic Party. Mm-hmm. And in some ways, they're kind of like the Lib Dems, but in other ways, like I feel like the Lib Dems sort of have a sort of brand, like that they're very sort of centrist and they think that Labour is like too far to the left, and they're kind of like the Lib Dems are like the party of like, the sort of the professionalized urban middle class, right? Like the kind of the upwardly mobile kind of university educated types.
Can I challenge? I know this is meant to be about Canadian politics, but can I challenge that?
Okay.
The Lib Dems are basically and as I say this as a former card-carrying member of the Liberal Democrats, the Lib Dems stand for whatever the local issue is, and it doesn't matter if it contradicts all of the party policies that have come before. And so they're fantastic like local campaigners. And so the last election, where Labour won a landslide, like the Conservatives were just decimated, the Lib Dems ran on like clean water, like we need to clean our rivers. And I just think that that's such an adorable, cute, quaint, like standing, and it's one of the highest number of seats that they've managed to return in the modern political era.
Yeah. Well, that's not really the brand of the NDP, I would say. The NDP.
No.
The NDP likes to think of itself as like the further left party, like the party that's to the left of Trudeau. They kind of have their origins in, frankly, sort of like the same kind of like socialist kind of movement that the Labour Party of the UK grew out of. But because, as you know...
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, but because, socialism is not as popular on this continent as it is back in even in England, let alone the rest of Europe, the NDP sort of never rose to the level that the Labour Party did. So in that sense, in Great Britain, there used to be a Liberal Party that was very powerful and dominant, Gladstone and all that, right? And then it sort of drifted off. And then the Labour Party displaced it. Whereas in Canada, it's kind of the opposite, is that the Liberal Party was never displaced and has always remained powerful, just as it was powerful in the 19th century. And then the NDP, which is like Canada's equivalent of like old Labour, has always kind of remained on the margins of Canadian politics. So it's the perennial sort of third or often fourth place, even behind the Quebec Nationalist Party that you mentioned before. So that's a pretty substantial difference.
My God. Somehow that now has made everything make sense.
Yeah, the colors are confusing though. I agree.
The colors are very if you could write a sternly worded letter to somebody over there, that would be really nice. If we could unify like all of the colors based on where they are.
Yes.
And then do you have like a green party? I assume you have a green party. Everyone's got a green party.
Yeah, I'm sorry to say we do, and it's pretty flaky in the way.
Are they like the crazy greens, or are they like so crazy greens? I mean like Julia Stein kind of greens, like USA greens, or are they like, oh, we are actually quite serious about this, we just love the climate, like in Germany?
Yeah, well, I mean, the Green Party of Canada is like much less sort of professionalized than the Green Party of Germany and of many of the other sort of Western European democracies. I would say it's maybe a little bit less unhinged than the Green Party of America, but it's also just a very weird party. It's very much its own thing, because the Green Party of Canada is just defined by one woman, Elizabeth May, who has been like party leader for life. You know, she's been party leader for like 20 years. The party's whole identity is based around her and her individual popularity. She was like the first Green Party MP ever elected. So she has just like, everything about the party has revolved around her. And, you know, whenever there's debates, you know, she's always on the debate stage with the other party leaders. So she's just been kind of like this omnipresent sort of figure in Canadian politics for the last 2 decades. And some people like her, some people sort of like her vibe, her energy. She's quite kind of, I would say, eccentric and has a lot of different opinions on issues that go beyond just climate. And I think that's one thing that makes her different than other Green Party leaders. She doesn't sort of seem laser focused on climate things. She has a lot of other sort of things that she likes to talk about. In my opinion, some real sort of conspiracy theory kind of minded stuff. But, you know, people can take her or leave her, but it seems like most Canadians are happy to leave her. She's, like I said, she's been basically, you know, offering herself up for 20 years and, you know, can't get more than like, I think 3 seats and like, I don't know, 3% of the vote or whatever. So, you know, God bless her.
Can I ask another?
Yes.
Can I ask another? Well, good for her. I do have you guys have first past the post as well, right?
We do, yeah.
And what do you think about that?
I mean, I have sort of, you know, nuanced opinions on that. Like, I think objectively there's a lot of problems with it, and we all know sort of the case against it. I do also think, though, that in a very sort of like old-fashioned kind of small c conservative sense, it's defensible in the sense that it's kind of like the neutral inheritance. You know, we've sort of gained it from generations of politicians past. And I very much worry about the idea when you change the political system today, when you change the electoral system today, it's being done by currently serving politicians who have their own sort of partisan interests. And so it just seems to me that if you're, you know, the current system, we know that all sorts of different political parties can get elected under it. So in that sense, it feels kind of neutral. It might be unfair, but it's politically neutral. So you could also create, but then you would replace it with a system that is more fair, but in some ways less politically neutral, because it will be shaped by the partisan interests of the currently serving politicians who will benefit from it. And that just to me feels like a bit of a conflict of interest that I've always kind of had a hard time with. But in much the same way as in the UK, like every time proposals for reform have been brought to the public votes it down. So there is kind of a sense that this is an issue that is just kind of dead. You know, Prime Minister Trudeau famously was elected vowing to change the system, but, you know, he abandoned it, I think in part because he knew it couldn't get through.
Yeah, I mean, Labour did this. Tony Blair did the same thing. Like whenever you've won with the system, you're like, well, then why would I change it? I've won. So no one this time around is like running on any kind of like electoral reform or anything like that.
I think sort of political reform has really become a very low salience issue, in part because, as you observed at the top, right, like the Canada-US sort of thing has just really sucked all of the oxygen out of everything, and it just kind of feels like that's what this election is going to be decided on, the basis of who is the best prime minister to stand up to Trump and, you know, have a robust economic agenda to deal with the aftermath of the tariffs that were constantly told are coming. They have never really fully materialized. They keep getting extended, you know, 1 month later, 1 month later, 1 month later. But, you know, if they do come someday, we have to have faith that the person we've elected is the right man to deal with it. So
I have 2 questions, if that's okay.
Okay, all right. No, that's quite all right.
But
yeah, sure.
The tariffs, I kind of understand why he wants to put tariffs on Mexico. Like there was a like, if you do this, then we won't do tariffs. Like it was around like fentanyl and drug production and stuff like that. I still don't know why he's doing this to Canada.
Yeah.
And like there was like periods of like negotiation, and I'm like, but what is Canada negotiating? He's just putting the tariffs on, and it isn't clear why there's a tariff on it other than American protectionism. So what's the point, JJ? How?
It's a very good question. I mean, I've talked about this a lot. Other sort of Americans and foreign correspondents often ask me, like, why is this happening? And Trump has offered like no fewer than a dozen justifications that contradict each other and, you know, fall in and out of fashion at any given time. You know, sometimes it's about fentanyl. Sometimes it's about illegal immigration. Sometimes it's about this idea that, Canada and the US have like a trade imbalance, and that's like fundamentally bad because Trump doesn't understand what a trade deficit is. Sometimes it's just that tariffs are inherently good and Trump just likes tariffs and has to make an example of Canada. Sometimes you hear this idea that there's a faction in the Trump administration that wants to use tariffs to offset income tax cuts that are coming at some point. And then, of course, sometimes Trump just kind of postures that Canada is just a fundamentally like dumb and illegitimate country that should become part of America, and that tariffs are like, I guess, some way to weaken or delegitimize the country in that direction. And as well, sometimes this apparently has something to do with our military funding and not spending enough on NATO. So it's just, it really sort of comes off like it's a solution in search of a problem. And it just seems like it's a weird ideological fixation of Trump's that's not fully rational. And that's relevant in a political context because it has made a very high salience issue, not just who can like deal with Trump in some amorphous sense, but also which prime minister has an agenda to kind of rebuild the Canadian economy in a direction that will make us kind of like tariff resistant, right? So that's talking about like less economic dependence on America, kind of like more trade within Canada, more reliance on other trade partners, and just kind of things like that. So it's very much about like who can be the steward of a strong, like more independent, more self-sufficient Canadian economy, in addition to like, who can, go eye to eye with Trump in the Oval Office, Zelensky style.
So, God, well, that didn't go very well.
Yeah.
Thank you for indulging me. So, like, what
Of
is
course.
the vibe? Like, all I know is that, like, some of the polls have tightened, like, a lot. Like, it was going to be a big wipeout for Trudeau, and now it looks like Carney's a savior. But is the issue is it really just who's going to stand up to Trump the best? And isn't that really frustrating as a voter? Because there's other things in life apart from who the American president is.
Definitely, I would say the morale on the conservative side is getting kind of low, because the conservatives had, under Trudeau, because Trudeau was so unpopular, the conservatives had looked like they were cruising to not just a victory, but like the biggest landslide in Canadian history. And swapping out Trudeau seems like it helped the Liberal Party a lot. The threat of Trump seems like it boosted the fortunes of the Liberal Party a lot, just through a kind of like rally around the flag kind of support for the incumbent government as sort of the symbol of Canadian resistance. And as well, like nationalism in Canada tends to be more on the left-wing side, so left-wing parties tend to benefit when the country is in a sort of patriotic mood. But I agree with you, like, and particularly, you're a Brit living in America. I'm a Canadian. I've always had a great deal of affinity for the U.S. as well. And so I don't really like it when the dominant political conversation in Canada becomes just about anti-Americanism and who can stand up to America, and then, all this sort of rhetoric about how much we hate the U.S. and this kind of thing. But it plays well with voters because, there's always been an undercurrent of anti-Americanism in Canadian society, as there has been in British society. So it feels like there's not really any incentive to talk about anything else. That puts the Conservatives, though, on a bit of a defense, because we think of the Conservative Party in Canada as traditionally being the more kind of pro-America party. Certainly the fact that Trump is a conservative and Pierre Poilievre is a conservative, the Liberal Party is very keen to point that out as often as they can, and to portray Pierre as being a kind of like Trumpy sort of figure, right? So, I don't know, definitely, it's a tough time to be a conservative, because the polls are pretty unambiguous that at the very least this is a neck and neck battle. And I feel like the vibe, the conventional wisdom is that it's probably more Carney's to lose at this point, which is just a dramatic, upending of where conventional wisdom had been just even a few weeks ago.
I mean, how exciting. We had one of the most boring election cycles ever, because they basically tried the same thing. The Conservative Party, who were in power for like over a decade in the UK, basically were like, oh, we've had awful leaders. Let's try another one. And then the idea was like Rishi Sunak was going to have like a little bit of runway to make people not hate him. And then he'd have a chance to like at least not get the lowest number of seats that the Tories have ever had. And now he has the lowest number of seats that the Tories have ever had. Whereas for y'all, the Liberals, the gamble paid off. And I'm sorry, I think that's so exciting. I know it's from like an outsider's perspective. I obviously have like no skin in the game whatsoever. Like I don't care if the ex Bank of England boss becomes Prime Minister of Canada. But it's like this neck and neck race thing. I think is very, very. It's thrilling. I haven't been this hooked about something Canadian since Drag Race Canada.
Well, you'll have to be tuning in attentively on April 28th, which is the day that the election results will be coming in. But thank you so much, Jazza, for your distinctly British take on all of this.
Well, it's all I can do. It's provide that. Thank you for having me. This is fun.
Tim Miller is a popular American political pundit. He is the main face of The Bulwark, a popular YouTube channel and podcast network featuring commentary from so-called Never Trump Republicans. All right, Tim, thanks so much for spending some time.
What's up, JJ? Hey, Canada. We want to do it. We're planning. I'm desperate to do a live Bulwark event in Canada, so we're working on this.
Oh, yeah?
Oh, yeah. I want to come hang out up north, maple syrup, the whole thing. Do it all.
Make it Vancouver. We don't get enough love up here as the third city.
Well, that's pretty far. I don't know. We'll see what we can do.
So I just wanted to ask, as my first question, Tim, do you think there's much awareness in America of Canada's sort of internal political situation right now?
I think that among super political observers, there's a higher awareness than there is traditionally. Like I think that there were probably many years where even people who are very into politics here had no idea what's happening in Canadian politics. I think right now, because of obviously Trump's attacks on Canada, but also even before that, like among the right-wing media ecosystem, there's like this interest in Pierre, that like he was a little bit more of a dynamic figure than like the right wing has had in Canada in a while. And so there were like folks rooting for him. And then now, obviously you're seeing interest in Carney because, he's sticking a finger in the eye of Trump. So you're seeing some interest from him on the left. So I think more, I don't think that there's like a deep knowledge of like random members of parliament or anything like that. But I think that the general outline of like kind of the kerfuffle and all the weirdness that's happening in Canada right now, it's drawing a little more attention than usual.
So what is your sense of sort of the two candidates, Carney and Pierre? You clearly know their names. What is your sort of sense of who they are and what they're all about?
Yeah, I can't pronounce the last name. Polyev.
Like it's just like Polly, like a Polly wants a cracker, and then Ev. Yeah.
Okay, I did have it right. I just didn't have confidence in myself. I see Polyev as kind of like I could be wrong about this, but my perception of him is kind of as like a DeSantis type, kind of like a traditional conservative that's like doing a little bit of the culture war nationalist stuff that you kind of have to do these days on the right, both in Canada and here. But, is really at his core more of kind of like a traditional small government conservative that also is a social conservative, at least for Canada. So that's my impression of him. What do you think? Is that right?
I think that's more or less correct. What about Carney now? What's your sort of sense of who he is?
Carney, I see as kind of like a bulwarky type guy, like a center-left globalist technocrat. Which I say globalist is a compliment. I know that's not in vogue these days on the YouTubes, but center-left globalist kind of technocrat, who wants to, who's just going to be like a make the government run kind of lefty, but not like movement leftist, not far left. Maybe slightly more to the left of like a median Democrat in America, just because Canada's slightly more to the left, but like not so much. That's my perception of him.
Yeah, I think that's fair, and certainly we think of Carney in contrast to Trudeau, and I think in that sort of perspective, we think of Carney as being more moderate than Trudeau was.
So I guess my question for you is that true? Is he more moderate than Trudeau, or is he basically indistinguishable from Trudeau, but he's presenting as moderate because Trudeau's unpopular, and so he's picked a couple of things that he disagrees with him on?
Well, that's one of the great questions of this election that we're in right now. Carney has been prime minister for less than 2 weeks, so he's never held political office before, so he is kind of like an untested sort of political brand. And it is sort of difficult, I think, for a lot of people to really sort of distinguish what is like marketing spin, sort of what you sort of said, like what is him attempting to distance himself from Trudeau for the purposes of winning an election in which we know the Liberal Party is sort of historically unpopular, and then what is actually a sort of sincere expression of his distinct political philosophy as something that is, maybe a little bit more to the center of what Trudeau actually believes. And this is relevant because, the Conservatives are running a campaign in which they're just arguing that, Trudeau and Carney are two sides of the same coin. They have no distinguishing features at all.
Well, everybody likes to be pandered to, so I'm happy as a central leftist, that center neoliberal, whatever you want to call me, that Carney is pandering to me. So yeah, that's great. I like being pandered to. But honestly, besides that, JJ, I like Freeland and Doug Ford are probably the only Canadian politicians I could name besides those two. So that's where I'm at.
That sort of flows into my next question, which maybe you've already answered. But do you have any understanding at all of the other parties in Canada?
No, I don't. I couldn't.
That's all right.
There's the Greens, I guess. Do you have a Greens?
Oh God, yes, we do. I'm sorry to say, the Green Party is quite flaky, even by the standards of Green parties in other places.
Are the Greens pro-Russian in Canada too, or is that just a European and American phenomenon?
It's interesting that there doesn't really sort of seem to be like a really like out and proud pro-Russian cohort in Canadian politics, the way there seems to be in so many other countries, even other Western countries. And I'm not quite sure what, there's a lot of sort of fear-mongering about like who's on the side of the Chinese and who's sort of laundering Chinese propaganda, but you don't hear as much about sort of pro kind of Russia stuff. The interesting thing though that you sort of alluded to before is that it has been interesting to me to notice how many people in like Trump's inner circle, within sort of MAGA world, had been boosting for Pierre, right? I remember, I can give you a good David Frum-esque anecdote here, where I was loading up this website where you can listen to just random radio stations in the US, and you just kind of click a button and it gives you a random radio feed. And then I clicked on it, and then I ran.
That's a very JJ activity.
Very much so.
Yeah, I'm going to spin the roulette wheel and just get a random radio station somewhere in the American heartland.
Yes. But anyway, so I do this, and then I get a radio feed. It's some sort of right-wing shock jock type. And he's really boosting for Pierre. He's like, have you seen this guy in Canada? He's so awesome. He's like, you watched, and then there's, of course, this viral clip of Pierre eating an apple and talking off a reporter, and people are really obsessed with this. And so he's like, oh, this guy's awesome. He's going to show that woke cuck Trudeau who's boss. And the name, Tim, of that radio host I was listening to was Dan Bongino, who is now, of course, the deputy FBI director, right? And so this is interesting to me because Trump, as you might have noticed, has been really down on Pierre lately, and had in his Laura Ingraham thing was sort of saying like, I actually think that the Liberals should win. They're actually better, right? So what do you make of all that? Like, is there any method to this madness at all? Some people in Canada, some right-wingers in Canada who don't want to accept that Trump is rooting for the enemy have tried to say, well, he's playing a four-dimensional chess or whatever. Do you think there's anything to that?
Trump is eating the pieces. Here's what Trump does. He compliments people that compliment him. And so he is annoyed. He probably knows nothing about Pierre, to be honest. He probably knows extremely little. What he knows is that he's supposed to be the conservative and that he said mean things about the tariffs. And so that's it. You're done. Trump. If you attack Trump, you're done. If you compliment him, it's great. If either of us put on a red hat right now and said, hey, we love Donald Trump, we've changed our mind, we're totally wrong about him, immediately Trump would send a bleat about us on his social media and welcome us and say how great we are. Like that, he's a very simple man in that regards. So I think that is really all that's happening there. And the other thing is he doesn't care about anybody himself. He really doesn't. He just fundamentally doesn't care. And so I think he's being rarely honest with Laura Ingraham. When Laura is trying to appeal to his supposed conservative sensibilities or whatever, saying essentially like, you're hurting the conservative in Canada. Don't we want, like she's trying to ask him a leading question. Don't we want the conservative in Canada to win? And Trump's just like, I don't give a hell what happens in Canada. I don't care if the conservative wins, like whatever. If he's mean to me, then no, screw him, right? And so he doesn't care about the underlying philosophy about whether conservative policies are advanced in Canada. He just doesn't care about that at all, one way or the other.
Do you think, can you imagine a scenario in which Pierre becomes sort of popular with the MAGA base if he gets in? Like if he becomes Prime Minister of Canada, if you have this kind of conservative Prime Minister running Canada, Trudeau is gone, and then you have a sort of a conservative versus conservative sort of dynamic. Do you think that would in any way improve US-Canada relations, just thinking about this objectively? Or is Trump kind of so far gone as far as this goes that it really makes no difference?
I mean, I guess I don't really see how you improve it unless he then like goes along with the tariffs, right? It's not, unless he and Trump get aligned on the tariffs, and maybe there's a way to get Trump aligned with, some kind of fake victories or something. And you can imagine. But look, the reality is, from the MAGA point of view, and I mean the pure MAGA, the Trumpists, right? Obviously, if you're people who are Trump enablers, who are conservative, who will like Pierre, your Ben Shapiro's, we mentioned already, Laura Ingrams, but like MAGA world will only like Pierre if he sucks up to Trump and if he triggers their enemies, because that's what it is. It's a movement that has some ideology, but it's mostly a movement about negative partisanship and negative polarization, right? Like they're united by sharing the same hatreds. So if Pierre were to get in there and do a lot of like dunking on Trudeau or do a lot of dunking on the Europeans who are not being nice enough to Trump or what, I don't exactly know what that would look like. Like maybe there's a way to troll his way into MAGA's good graces. But I think it'd be challenging to do that while also advancing Canada's interest.
I'll tell you an interesting, fun trivia fact is that a friend of mine, Jamil Giovanni, who is a member of parliament in Canada, used to be a kind of right-wing talk show radio host up here. I've been on his show many times. He was J.D. Vance's roommate at Yale. And he is being groomed, I think, for high office in a theoretical Pierre administration. I think he could even be foreign minister, because I think that there would be a lot of sort of weight put on that pre-existing personal relationship that he has with Vance. I think he was like at his wedding and stuff like this. And so I think that there would be a lot of hope, a lot of trust sort of placed in people like him in a Pierre government to make nice with the Trump administration based on an assumption that they can kind of speak the same language and talk conservative to each other, and then that would sort of build on pre-existing. But again, like, you don't know with Trump, because this is maybe thinking too rationally about a fundamentally irrational government.
There's something to be said for that, only in the fact that J.D. Vance doesn't really have very many friends, is my understanding. So, like, by being someone that is a friend, quote unquote, of J.D. Vance, like, you're on a short list. Not a lot of phone calls that are happening in there to the VP's office. So, I don't know, man. I conceivably, it's less about your side and more about our side, right? Like, Trump is so erratic and irrational, right? That it's kind of like, sure. I mean, maybe he decides, right, that like, he wants to just pick 2 Canadian liberal industries to punish, and he tariffs them, and he calls that a great victory for the golden age. And, him and JD cut a deal with Pierre and Jamal or whatever, and they have a confab in Mar-a-Lago where they talk about how great Donald Trump is and how you guys are going to build do a Mount Rushmore to him in Canada or whatever. And like, that's possible, I think. But it's also possible that Trump is just so dug in on the tariffs and on punishing Canada and the fact that Pierre was not nice to him, that it's that there's no way out of it beside that also aligns with the economic interests of Canada.
So I guess sort of my last question to you, Tim, would just sort of be like, does this matter? Like, are you interested in the outcome of the Canadian election, or does it fundamentally feel like you just basically sort of said it's ultimately like a much sort of lower salience variable relative to just Trump?
I have an emotional connection right now to Mark Carney, partially because he's pandering to me, partially because it feels like an opportunity for somebody in our hemisphere to stand up to the MAGA devil, since my countrymen wouldn't do it. So I do feel like I have kind of some emotional skin in the game, and I don't. That it has literally nothing to do with the policies that would be advanced by either administration, because they're not going to impact me one way or the other here in Louisiana. But just at like kind of a gut level, that it would be nice to see Trump, get poked in the eye and cost somebody an election, but with by his idiocy, and the fact that we've had a lot of Canadians that have been rallying to our Never Trump media outlet. I don't know. I feel an emotional and cultural kindred now, and so I don't know. I'd enjoy it. I would drink a Molson's to cheers Mark Carney's victory, which is not something I would have said about any of the past Trudeau elections.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for your insights, Tim. It's nice hearing the American perspective.
All right, thanks, JJ. Talk to you soon, brother. I love your feed.
Cole Hogan is a professional Canadian political commentator and strategist. He has done work for the Conservative Party over the years and often appears as a political analyst on Canadian TV. So the first thing I wanted to ask you, Cole, was just what do you make of the timing of this election? Because we know that Prime Minister Carney made a conscious choice to have an election just a few days after being sworn in as Prime Minister. There had been some talk that, maybe he was going to try to extend the parliamentary session, maybe govern as prime minister for a bit longer, maybe work something out with the NDP or whatever. But instead, he just seemed to pull the plug immediately, which seems like a pretty cocky move. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I think Justin Trudeau didn't really give, the Liberal leadership contenders any say in the matter. He resigned on January 6th, and then the Liberal leadership rules played out where they had to have a whole leadership race in 2 months. And what that did is it left the winner, Mark Carney, with not a lot of options before Parliament was set to resume on March 24th, today. Obviously, that didn't happen. Mark Carney was at Rideau Hall, and he spoke to the Governor General, and now we will have an election. But we saw Mark Carney try to use the time that he had available to himself to try to look as prime ministerial as possible. We saw his trip to the UK. We saw, a few policy announcements here and there to try to make the best of the time that he had left as prime minister before he was forced to make this decision, because clearly, I think he didn't want to go into the House and potentially face a vote in the House of Commons, just not dealing with the NDP at all, or potentially even entering into any sort of coalition agreement. So, off to the races we go.
So the conventional wisdom is that this election is just going to be basically defined by Canada-US relations, the relations with Trump, who's best equipped to deal with the tariffs. Do you think that that's sort of broadly true, or do you think that there's any chance that any other issues will emerge?
Yeah, I think for the most part, like right now, it looks like the election will be framed by, who best to deal with Donald Trump and tariffs. But I think we'll see, a similar dynamic to what played out in Ontario, where, Doug Ford was out there front and center talking about Donald Trump and the threat of tariffs back and forth, the ongoing threats. And it became really about Canada and Ontario's economy at large and who was best to deal with that. And we saw Doug Ford lead the whole election. So I think we'll see something play out similar, where the tariff issue will play back to the Canadian economy. And this is an issue that when Canadians are polled, it usually comes down to the Conservatives, who have a substantial lead on who is best to manage the economy. On a host of other issues, the Conservatives had the lead as well. In some polls, we see Mark Carney and the Liberals, marked by Canadians as best to deal with Trump. We've seen some variance there. So I think that's what each respective party will try to make the election about. We'll see the Conservatives pivot from tariffs and Trump to who's best to deal with the Canadian economy. And we'll see Mark Carney and the Liberals just talk strictly about who is best to deal with Donald Trump, that being where the respective parties have their strengths right now.
So the polls have been pretty good for the Liberals lately. I think that surely played a role in why the election is being held now. What do you make of the polls? Are we overstating their significance this early in the election season?
Yeah, I think as fast as the polls shot up for the Liberals, they can tank just as fast. The Conservatives have had a sustained lead, anywhere from 15 points to 25 points over the last 2 years. And now we've seen those narrow into a statistical tie in a lot of places. Obviously, you can't extrapolate, leadership race results over a, federal election. But when I look at the results that Mark Carney got in Quebec in particular, where there was maybe about 60 to 100 individuals that voted in the Liberal leadership race, those are people who, are dedicated partisans who spend their time volunteering, they donate, they get out there and knock doors for the party. And seeing very low, abysmal numbers in a province like that, that's so critical to Liberal fortunes, sort of gives me a little bit of concern for how competitive they might actually be, and how they contend against the Bloc Québécois. The second thing that I think about is, and this is another thing you can't extrapolate onto, a federal election, but the Ontario provincial election results. The Ontario Liberal vote share, their vote was very inefficient in terms of the amount of votes they got, in contrast to the amount of seats they got. So they got around 1.2 to 1.4 million votes, but only ended up with 12 seats, where the Ontario NDP, they had about 800,000 votes and ended up with 20-some seats. So I think we can see a similar dynamic play out where, Liberal support is concentrated in a lot of cities, maybe similar to the 30-person caucus they had in 2011, where they don't have support across the country, but their support is concentrated in particular areas. So that might be a potential dynamic we can see play out.
That's interesting because I feel like what a lot of people would say is that it has historically been the Conservatives who have the problem with sort of vote efficiency. The Conservatives are kind of too popular in Western Canada, and that can result in them winning the popular vote, which they have in the last 2 elections, but it's ultimately not very strategically useful. But you're kind of saying the opposite, that in some ways it's the Liberals that have more to worry about with this particular inefficiency phenomenon?
Yeah, I think, in 2019 and 2021, we saw in particular the Conservatives were, they won the popular vote, but did not end up with as many seats as the Liberals, in the minority scenario in both elections, where we basically had, Andrew Scheer got a similar result to Aaron O'Toole. But I think what affects this as well is the, lacking NDP support. So in a lot of, these Ontario seats, a lot of seats in Metro Vancouver, these are seats where the NDP would have played a factor. And now that their vote is kind of tanking in those particular provinces, it might be more of a straight up red and blue race, even though province by province, from like BC to Ontario, basically, it's more or less a blue or orange world. Federally, now that it's a blue and red world, it might be a different scenario altogether.
It's interesting because I saw a article in the CBC this morning talking about sort of like the wipeout of the NDP in Manitoba. So I think, yeah, the idea that it's kind of a red versus blue race, a very sort of clean kind of 2-party election in a way we haven't seen in quite a while. So are you basically prepared then to kind of write off the minor parties, beginning with the NDP?
At the moment, yeah, I think that, when Canada-US relations are so at the forefront, the NDP is just sort of, evaporated into the background here. And I don't think the party was ever, trusted as, a strong source of policy on foreign affairs. And I think that's why they're a non-factor right now. Like, things could change. And as a conservative, during this election, I would like a competitive NDP in a lot of these ridings to potentially split the left. But right now, they seem to be a complete non-factor.
What about the Bloc Québécois, right? Like, I guess they're kind of like the third party factor that is probably more worth caring about, because if they're very strong in Quebec, that's a problem for the Liberals too, right?
Yeah, it looks like the Bloc Québécois is, second to the Liberals in most polls in Quebec. But again, I really wonder about Liberal strength in Quebec. This is a province that is so crucial to Liberal fortunes and how they've formed multiple majority governments over, our country's history. So I'm really curious about how much they can pull off, general support there in terms of how their organization and how they get there, especially with a surging Parti Québécois, provincially there. I wonder if there's any sentiment for the federal Liberals in that province.
Cole, you must validate my pre-existing bias on this one. Can we safely write off the Green Party as being any sort of factor worth considering?
Yeah, I would agree. I think that they're also going to be a non-factor in this election.
The sort of decline of the PPC has been interesting as well, and I suppose is one sort of variable that bodes well for the Conservatives, because in the last election they were, they didn't cost the Conservatives victory, but they definitely sort of had a role sort of splitting the vote in certain ridings. But now they're kind of a bit of a non-factor as well, right? What do you think of all that?
Maxime Bernier's lack of an ability to sort of punch through in any major way, I think that, for lack of a better term, it just is not palatable to mainstream political viewers and the electorate. So I think, that's a vote that's not going to go anywhere. I know in Portage Lisgar, in Manitoba, whenever it was he ran, I can't remember exactly when, but they took about 19 to 20% of the vote, and that was their highest vote share. I think this was in 2021. I don't think they're getting any result better than that, and they're certainly not winning any seats.
Yeah, it's interesting. in the same way that sort of the liberal vote has kind of consolidated, like the liberal, the small L sort of progressive vote has sort of consolidated, the sort of small C conservative vote also seems like it's consolidated under Pierre Poilievre's leadership. He's been a more, I suppose, unifying figure for the sort of the center right in this country.
I would say so. I look at the conservative leadership results from when Pierre Poilievre ran. The membership boosted from about 220,000 to 675,000, and you saw rallies, particularly across the West, that had 5,000-6,000 people at them. So this is like a guy in a movement of conservative who's coalesced a lot of center right support in Canada and brought a lot of new people into the membership at large. So I think that's someone, the conservative tent has a lot of, different right-wing voices and different sections of the conservative movement within it. Pierre Poilievre has been able to coalesce all of those behind support for the Conservative Party.
So let's talk a little bit about demographics. Let's talk about geography and also just, sort of the population as well. When you look at the map of Canada, on election night, sort of what ridings, what regions are you going to be paying like particularly close attention to?
Well, in particular, definitely Ontario. I think on the Conservative side, I think we can eke out a win there, and we need to. That is a key part of our electoral success. If we're going to win a majority government, it will be through Ontario. We'll be able to take the West. I think we'll be competitive in Metro Vancouver, but it's really going through the GTA. The Conservatives can't win without. We can't win a majority, I should say, without getting to the most seats in Ontario, and the Liberals can't win without Quebec. Historically, anytime the Liberal Party has won a majority government, it's been through success in Quebec. And I'll be looking too, if the Liberals, if they do really well in Atlantic Canada, and then they also take Quebec, that's their road to a potential majority government or minority. It'll flow and start in those two provinces for the Liberals.
So you're obviously very plugged into a sort of conservative world, conservative strategy. Do you have a sense of where, like specifically, the Conservatives feel like they can make gains, either in terms of sort of more specific geography, but also just in terms of like demographics? Like, are there types of voters they're really sort of seeking out this time? Because obviously, to win, you're trying to find new sources of voters, either by sort of activating new people or converting people. Do you think the Conservatives have a sort of sense that they have some fertile ground as far as that goes?
Yeah, I think a lot of it's happening in the GTA. Those are like Liberal seats that we're trying to, take from, Mark Carney and the Liberal Party. On the digital side, there's been a lot of, Punjabi and Mandarin language ads, and those are running in the GTA and in the Metro Vancouver area. Those are places where we're competitive, and they're seats that were won by the Harper Conservatives for their first majority and was part of their governing coalition. So I think we're mostly looking at the GTA, Ontario as a whole, and BC with all the western provinces, Alberta, British Columbia, Saskatchewan, Manitoba. Sweep all of that together, and there is the winning Conservative coalition.
Final question I want to ask you, Cole. Being objective and nonpartisan, as I'm sure you have the capacity to be, if you had to sort of say what are the greatest sort of strengths and weaknesses of the two main candidates, of Mark Carney and Pierre Poilievre, what would you say?
Sure. On the Conservative side, I think a natural strength here is that for the last 2 years, Conservatives have led on a variety of issues in Canada. So just the economy, addressing the cost of living, immigration, crime, housing. These are all things that have been in a very sad state in Canada for the last 10 years of liberal rule. And that's why, in my opinion, that like the Conservatives do so well on each of these issues, because these things have been in disarray for the last decade. So that's where we will see the Conservatives try to focus on almost every domestic issue that Conservatives lead. And that's where we'll see Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives focus their efforts. The potential weakness here for the Conservatives is the ongoing specter of Donald Trump in the election. At any time, this guy could, say something and upend the political atmosphere in Canada. And we saw that's, what he did when he said that he would prefer to deal with a liberal and that America could get a better deal dealing with a Liberal prime minister in Canada. Now, the Conservatives highlighted that and said, well, of course Trump would say that because he's looking at the last Liberal decade of rule under Justin Trudeau in Canada. He sees that we have a weak economy and will be coming from a weaker bargaining position if Liberals continue their policies. So that's the potential. But then again, I don't contest to know or look inside the mind of Donald Trump with any authority. I think that would be an unfortunate place for any of us to be. But I think that's a weakness there where Trump could say something that just upends the whole political atmosphere and conversation once again. For Mark Carney and the Liberals, I think that their advantage is that right now in a lot of polls, and there's some variance here, but Canadians, when asked, trust the Liberals more to deal with Donald Trump than they do the Conservatives. And, there's been some back and forth to the degree of trust there, but I think that's the one thing that they're going to focus on, because on every other issue, they have to point back to the Justin Trudeau Liberal decade and their economic record, the record on immigration, on crime, housing has not been positive. So they're going to want to talk about Donald Trump as much as possible in order to stay away from their domestic record, which is obviously very poor. I think the weakness for the Mark Carney Liberals will be Mark Carney himself. I don't think that he is, a trained political athlete, not like Pierre Poilievre. I don't think he's run in a major campaign like this in anything resembling maybe a book tour or something, but nothing compared to a full-on federal campaign when you're talking to the media every day and you're meeting with real people every day. So we'll see how Mark Carney can perform. We've seen him answer questions about his conflicts of interest, his assets. He seems very uncomfortable when asked about those topics. Also, Brookfield Asset Management moving their headquarters to New York instead of Canada. We've seen him uncomfortable with that. We'll see if that continues to be an issue. I think it will. And that'll sort of be up in the forefront in terms of the Conservative line of attack on him as well, because I think there's some remaining questions as, his personal wealth, his assets, and, any potential conflicts he might have. So the weakness for the Liberals is Carney himself as a political athlete. Can he keep up? Will he make any massive flubs during the campaign? And, compared to the, Conservative election machine, how can he keep up?
Sounds like you're overall more bullish on the Conservatives' chances than a lot of other analysts in the press seem to be these days.
Well, I think, these are sugar rush polls. I think anything that goes up that fast in terms of a polling number can go down just as fast. I think you see the Conservatives stick between, 36 and 41, and you see the Liberals drop back down. And that's because you have an untested character with Mark Carney. The reason why they selected such a short time frame for the election is because Mark Carney is undefined. I think that the longer that the election goes on and Canadians get to know him, they're going to see some undesirable or not politically smart moves, and they're going to change their mind pretty quickly. And this is going to be, more of a race than Liberals might think it is right now.
Some good analysis there, Cole. Thank you so much for stopping by.
Of course. Thanks, JJ.
So hopefully you guys enjoyed that and feel a little bit up to speed about where the Canadian election stands now, just a few days after it was called. Let me know in the comments below if you have any other ideas for specific sorts of Canadian election coverage that you would like to see from me. I have a few more gimmicky video ideas up my sleeve, but I'm always open to hear more. This is actually going to be the 4th election that my YouTube channel has covered, which is pretty incredible. It's always a very exciting time, and I enjoy the trust that you guys put in me to give you an accurate and objective summary of how things are going. So another election video coming very soon, and until then, stay tuned.